Craig, I wonder if you could tell me where the practice of meditation originated from.
I think if you went back in history to just about any culture, you would find every culture has developed its forms of meditative and contemplative practice. And people have developed these approaches through experience and through practice because they find them very beneficial for lots of reasons. The benefits of them for mind and body have been recognized for a very long time. And so in terms of mindfulness as a form of practice, you would find mindfulness as a principle of being awake and the need to be aware. You would find that as a very important part of the philosophy and culture of just about any group that you cared to look at. In terms of the modern day, you would probably find that there's a more active expression of that in some of the Eastern sort of approaches to meditation, but you would in fact find very strong traditions of mindfulness and the need for awareness in every culture. So in a sense, it's not the sort of thing that one could divide up and say it's an Eastern or a Western thing. It's a very universal thing. It's a very practical thing. It's a very applicable thing to Western life and dealing with the stresses and strains of the life that we're leading these days.
When I think of meditation, it conjures up an idea in my mind of sort of a religious or perhaps spiritual practice. And certainly I'm aware of some religious groups having a strong emphasis on meditation. How does spirituality fit with meditation?
People will come to meditation for many different reasons. Most of the people that I see who are interested in meditation, whether they be students or people in their day-to-day life coping with stress at work or at home, or patients dealing with serious illness, chronic pain. Most of the reasons that people explore meditation are very pragmatic, practical, understandable sorts of reasons. And I think it's very important that a person comes at it from the point of view that's relevant for them, from the point of view of that we come at it from our own agenda. And if that's learning to cope with less stress, with chronic pain, then that's what's important to us. If it's learning to get a better night's sleep, learning to be able to get a better quality of night's sleep, then that's important to us, and learning how these sort of practices can help us with that. If it's learning to focus better on our studies and be more mindful and use our time more productively when we're studying, then that's relevant to us, not another agenda. Now, if one went back in history, one would also note that these contemplative practices, such as mindfulness, have a very strong tradition in the spiritual traditions. And they do have this aspect in that they can teach us an enormous amount about ourselves. We can understand ourselves much better, and in fact we do over time understand ourselves better. We become aware of important aspects of ourselves that we tend to ignore in the hurly-burly of worldly life. And so, as a means of self-exploration, as a means of finding our centre, of finding ourselves, finding, as T.S. Eliot said, the still point in the turning world, that sort of centre, that core of our being, or as Shakespeare said, to be or not to be, that is the question. In a manner of speaking, the meditation practices are spiritual in that way. But that is something that is only up to the person themselves as to if that's relevant, or if so, when it's relevant. So what often happens for people that learn meditation is initially there's an interest in the pragmatic concerns, but over time the practice deepens, and so an interest in self-awareness, in being, in finding our core, becomes more and more a priority. So a person can come at the practice for many different reasons, but it's certainly not a matter of having to take on an ideology or having to take on any sort of particular belief system that goes with it. One follows the practice at their own pace and in their own way.
Are there any dangers in meditating? For example, would there be any sort of contraindications where you would think that meditation might cause problems for people?
There are very few contraindications. I think that somebody who is having a psychotic illness and so on, I don't think meditation would be a very useful thing there. I think that with any meditation practice you require a certain level of insight and understanding about what's in the mind to be able to practice that sort of exercise. Yeah, so that would be an area where one would have to sort of exercise a bit of concern. Also, using meditation as the only form of treatment for significant depressive or anxiety problems, where sometimes there might be a requirement for other therapies, or the need to combine a meditation and mindfulness approach with other sort of counselling and so on, which could be very important. So one doesn't want to get it out of perspective or out of context with the total approach to dealing with serious illness or foregoing necessary medical therapies on occasions. Now, that having been said, meditation will be easier for some people than for others. Some people will find they take to it more easily than others. Now, in the normal run of things, just about anybody can learn to meditate, but it doesn't mean that we'll necessarily find it easy in the first instance. In the maturation of the process, one of the first things we notice, as we said, when you walk into the room and you turn on the lights, is that we notice there's a little bit of clutter. And that sometimes can, sort of cause a little bit of concern. So in a sense, that turning on the lights in terms of our thoughts, we see more of our thoughts. We can sometimes even become more aware of our stress or anxiety, or more aware of the mood. Now, if we can just practice an ability to sit with it, just to be with it, just to observe it and notice it, but in a slightly more objective way, then we can find that we can start to find a comfort within that, and then we can start to find that there can be a slow loosening of the amount of influence that it has. So we can sit with it so that those anxieties or tensions might still be there, but there's less tension associated with them. And then their amount of influence over time can slowly reduce, and then eventually their tendency to sort of turn up actually starts to reduce. So in the initial stages there can be greater awareness and sometimes a little bit of concern about that greater awareness. That's not a sign that a person's doing something wrong necessarily. It's just simply a sign that that's one of the first steps is in turning on the lights. So it's very important that a person takes it very gently, takes it at their own pace, and needs to be motivated themselves. It's not being forced into it or pushed into it when a person doesn't feel motivated, that we proceed in our own way and in our own pace.
In the sort of busy demands of life, finding time out to actually do meditation is quite difficult. Have you got any suggestions about how one might go about organising some time to meditate? And along with that question, is the place that one meditates important?
Certainly having conditions right and the place right that is more conducive to a little bit of peace and quiet can be very helpful, especially in the initial phases. We find over time we can actually practice and just simply learn to be mindful and at ease in more and more situations, even in due course in some quite crowded, cluttered situations. So certainly the place can be quite conducive and helpful, but one wants to, in a sense, learn to master all sorts of conditions. It is hard to find the time out unless we make it as a priority. And in due course, if we see the importance of it, we will make it a priority. But there are certainly many competing demands in the initial stages. It can sometimes take us weeks before we even get into a bit of a routine of practicing. Every time we remember, it's time to practice, the mind will come up with 100 excuses as to why we can't. Or it won't help anyway, or I'll never get anywhere, or I'm too tense to relax, or I'll just do, or one of the mind's favourite little deflectors is, I'll just do this first. It's time to meditate. Look, I'll just put the washing on first. Or, look, I'll just do something else first. The next thing we know, it's about 3 days later, and we've totally forgotten to practice. So the mind has lots of mechanisms to make it difficult to find the time, or even when the time is there, difficult to actually practice. And that's the sort of thing that we initially need to sort of learn to step over. If we appreciated the importance of it, the relevance of it, the helpfulness of it through our own experience, well then that starts to be its own motivator, and then we find it's actually not that difficult to find the time. It's just that it's become a priority. And other things that our life often becomes overfull of, we find, well, wait a sec, there's a certain amount of that that's beneficial, but we have to sort of get a bit of a balance right. And it is actually a basic human need to learn to stop, to learn to have time just to be quiet is an important commodity. But it's becoming a rarer commodity in this sort of busyness. We ordinarily in our day-to-day lives recognise being on full throttle and an exhaustion. We don't recognise that other state of restful awareness which we can and do need to cultivate.
So ideally, if you were putting aside some time for meditating, how long would you recommend as a start, a day? in an ideal world without any other pressures, how long, what sort of amount of time would you suggest?
Well, just getting into a routine of twice a day. I think twice a day is a good measure. And before meals is better than after meals. So after food cannot be more often sleepy, but we've obviously got to be flexible according to the needs and demands of the day and family and work and whatever. But these are optimal sort of guidelines. And if we just started twice a day with, say, 5 minutes twice a day, that would be very useful. And we may find over a few weeks that a week or two we can build that up to, say, 10 minutes twice a day. According to our level of motivation and interest and need, we can certainly build that up to 15 or even 20 minutes twice a day. That would be sort of, for the great majority of people, a sort of a pretty good maximum in terms of a balance of a busy life. One of the things that people often feel is, well, look, that's another 40 minutes if I build up to that, or even if I was practicing 10 minutes twice a day, that's 20 minutes a day. Where am I going to find the time for that? What people often find is that actually they save a lot of time because of the way we work and we go about our business, and also because we often find, in terms of prioritising, that we've filled our day with a lot more things than we often need to. So we find there's a refinement of our use of time. And we also find that we often get much better quality out of our sleep and our rest once we learn the art of coming to rest. So we often find we get a lot better value out of our sleep and our rest. And we get a lot better quality sleep. And interestingly, over time, people often find that they need less sleep rather than more because it's much better quality sleep. So they get better quality rest from their sleep and conserve their energy a lot better during the day. So people actually find over time they make time, they save an enormous amount of time. But building up to that sort of maximum, according to a person's interest, 10 minutes twice a day would be excellent, 20 minutes twice a day would be great, but that's got to come from the person themselves.
I've found in trying to meditate over the last few years that sometimes when you start meditating, your mind actually wanders off to all sorts of sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant interruptions, jobs that you need to do at work, anything to distract you. Do you have any suggestions about how to manage some of these intrusive thoughts?
Yes, it's one of the most common things that we notice is how distractible the mind actually is. And you give it just one simple thing to do, just sit with the breathing for a few minutes or just sit with the listening for a few minutes. And we find the mind fidgets around and worrying about the future and all the things I'm going to have to do and all the things I should have done and how's this going to work out. And this sort of thing tends to be the common experience. Now, many people feel, oh, look, I've got to make the mind quiet. I've got to stop the mind thinking. I've got to get these thoughts out of my head, and I can't practice meditation unless I do. And then we start struggling with the thoughts, trying to keep them out, almost like we're a soccer goalie and we're standing in front of the goal and we're going to stop the thoughts coming into our minds. And what we find is it actually becomes very counterproductive. And we find that we're not allowing our attention to rest where we're going to let it rest, but we've become sort of very tense and we struggle with the thoughts. And what our experience will soon teach us is struggling with the thoughts actually adds a lot of awareness to them, strengthens them. We find, in a sense, we almost meditate on these thoughts, meditate on these anxiety-producing thoughts or whatever, and it actually strengthens them because we're feeding them with attention, which is, in a sense, like their lifeblood. So we don't struggle with them. We let them come. If they come, we just let them come, but we let them go. In a sense, we cultivate a very easy indifference to them. In our normal day-to-day life, if we ever have a useful thought, well, then that's fine. We may, in our awareness, we may act on it, but in meditation practice, we just practice letting them come, letting them go. Yes, let the mind know that at the end of the practice, all these things that need attention, all the jobs and demands will get attended to, but for now the job is practicing attentiveness, practicing developing the state of mind in which we can better go about our activities when we finish the meditation practice. So one doesn't struggle with the thoughts, one doesn't even particularly need to wish that they weren't there, but one can practice a more objective awareness and a greater ability to let them come and let them go, and to develop some sort of choice about whether we take them up or not. And that's something that requires a little bit of practice. But it's not like somebody's doing something wrong if these thoughts come in, and it's not like you have to make your mind go blank or all those sorts of things that often make it difficult for people. In a sense, even if we notice there is distractibility, even if we notice the mind does go off into a dream regularly, just noticing that is extremely useful. and very gently correcting, because what we then notice is that that greater level of mindfulness and awareness starts to actually flow into our day more and more. And we start to actually pick ourselves up when we're stressed, when we're getting anxious during the day, and we notice the same kinds of processes going on. And then we can very gently correct at those times as well. So it's like that, what we're cultivating during the mindfulness practice, that starts to actually flow into more and more of our day, the longer that we practice.
The other experience I've had when I'm meditating is, rather than having intrusive thoughts, is sort of a sense of sleepiness. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that distinction between a sort of a sleepiness and a meditation experience.
Sometimes when there have been a lot of demands, we've been running on a bit of adrenaline and so on, that we practice the meditation, and there's a few minutes of restful awareness, and we can pretty soon find that all of a sudden, having taken the foot off the accelerator, there can be sleepiness. Now, the restful awareness, that presence, that connectedness, is to do with meditation, a very restful form of concentration. Not in the usual way we sort of think of concentration as being sweat on the brow and everything else. It's a very restful form of concentration. Sleep is not meditation, but one of the side effects of regular practice of meditation is better sleep. And sometimes, if we are that tired, we may need to actually have a little power nap, or a relaxing walk around the block just to sort of cool down, or some other activity, and then come to our meditation practice. But sleep and meditation are slightly different things, in fact quite different things, but better sleep is certainly one of the side effects of meditation.
So if one starts practicing meditation, how long could one expect before you'd notice the benefits on one's life? I mean, we're used to having very instant gratification and getting results quickly.
Yes.
In your experience, how long does it take before people really start to notice the benefits of it?
That varies enormously with a person's level of motivation, level of commitment, level of regularity with their practice and so on. And also what a person's working with initially. So even people with quite extreme anxiety, panic attacks and so on, can find that within a few weeks, 2-3 weeks, there's very significant gains. But that's often in the context of a very high level of commitment and regularity of practice, and slightly more prolonged practice than just the 5 minutes twice a day. And that can vary from that to a person who practices every so often and a little bit here and there, and finds that there's a very slow rate of progress over time. So that varies quite a lot. Most commonly, if a person starts to take up a practice, often within the first week or two, it's no small feat to actually be regular with it. To actually get the body in the chair twice a day is no small feat for most people. And so just with the regularity, and then within a few weeks of regular practice, then often after 3-4 weeks, most people are starting to notice increasingly significant changes, not just with the depth of their practice, but also with the way that they're managing stress in their day-to-day lives. So that would be the most common sort of thing. And then if a person stays with it over 4, 5, 6 weeks, then that sort of deepens further and further again. So that's a sort of ballpark figure, but it's obviously a very individual thing, and it varies with what the person's dealing with, and also it varies with the person's level of commitment and regularity with the practice. I should note it'd be like physical exercise. If you said to me, "Oh, what about physical exercise?" You have to be prepared to be a little bit patient with the process. Being result-driven, although as useful and productive as that might be in day-to-day life, can actually be counterproductive in meditation practice. The harder we try and get it right, the more we actually create obstacles for ourselves. The less we just allow the process to work quite naturally and by itself. And so in a way, we sit down to practice, and yes, there will be results from the meditation practice, but we're not trying to clutch at results, hold on to get results. We just practice the process and let the natural effects take place by themselves. We don't have to, in a sense, be concerned about them. It'd be like physical exercise. The worry about the fitness doesn't actually do it. The simple process of doing the physical exercise produces the fitness. And it's like that with the meditation. Worry about results can actually hinder the process. Just practicing the process and letting that accumulate over time is probably the way to go.
In terms of some of the benefits of meditation, there's two areas which I've found particularly helpful. One is that I'll often find when I'm meditating, apart from the intrusive thoughts, which sort of come and go like a wave, I'll often have a solution to a problem that, my mind's been meandering about. Now, I'm not sure if that's the point of the meditation. I don't think it really is, but I'm always amazed at how clear and wise some of the solutions that your mind actually pops out when it's in that still state.
Yes. It's one of the interesting side effects of meditation, that when the mind is a little bit, and that's like an expression of perceptiveness, very deep perceptiveness, insight, intuition, creativity, it starts to come from a different place. And the different place, in a sense, it's just that the covers, the interference with that insight, intuition, creativity gets removed. It's like a clarity of mind. It's like very cloudy, murky water that if you just let it stand, things settle to the bottom and it becomes clear and translucent again. And it's like that clarity of mind, that perceptiveness of mind, comes as a very natural side effect of the general amount of discursive and agitative thought. As soon as we stop feeding that so much, it naturally settles by itself. We don't have to wrestle it to the ground. It settles by itself. And then we find that the mind can prioritize better, decide better, understand better, and this is one of the very happy and natural side effects of meditation.
The second benefit that I've found as a general practitioner is that if I've had a very good meditate in the morning and I go into the clinic, my ability to listen is greatly enhanced. So rather than, if you like, analysing the patient's presentation instantly and coming up with a list of diagnoses in my mind or interpretations, I find I can sit back and actually hear the story they're telling me more clearly.
Yes. And that's a very nice example again of that sort of perceptiveness and that insight and that intuition that can then start to operate. And it's interesting, that's how a lot of geniuses describe how they work. I mean, Einstein used to talk about intuition being a sacred gift. But it's like from that clarity of thought and that depth of perception, then understanding arises. Then we communicate on a different level entirely, and it's a much deeper sort of level. But it arises from that awareness. It arises from that clarity of listening and perceptiveness. And that's quite a different sort of way of working. Normally this discursive activity of mind and the thinking and the worrying and the churning and the what-ifs and the maybes that we often get preoccupied with clouds the mind. It's a little bit like a sky, the sunlight can't get through because the clouds are in the way. Again, I referred to Hamlet before in the speech To Be or Not to Be, that is the question. And Hamlet goes on to describe his state of mind when he didn't know what to do and how to respond to the situation. And he describes his mind as being sickly dull with a pale cast of thought. And this thinking, this worrying, this churning of the mind actually gets in the way. And in a manner of speaking, if we meditate on those worries, we're practicing meditation, but we're practicing meditating on worries. We can meditate on depressing thoughts if we want to. See, what we give our attention to, in a manner of speaking, is what we meditate on. Unfortunately, we're meditating, if I could use this sort of manner of speaking about it, we're meditating on very unhelpful things. This very gentle process of mindfulness helps us, in a very gentle but persistent way, to soon get our attention onto what is useful, like our life and what's happening in it, responding to that, and finding that the encumbrances and the interference from these sorts of other thoughts start to have less and less influence. There's perhaps another analogy that helps us to understand the way in which we can relate to these anxieties and fears and other things that often worry us. It'd be like if an angry dog, a German shepherd, came running up to us. The most tempting thing in the world is to either run from it or to turn around and start hitting it. Either way, it's going to chase us or it's going to start attacking us. If we're, in a sense, less moved by it and we just continue to walk, noticing full well that it's there, but we sort of less moved by it and we just continue to walk, it very soon loses interest and goes somewhere else. It's a little bit like that with some of our anxiety-producing thoughts. We certainly acknowledge that they're there, but people, we become less reactive to them, and they do bark for a time, but then they go. And it's a little bit like that.
In your experience, are there any other difficulties that come up commonly when people start meditating that you've encountered?
Finding time, which we've touched on before, being initially more aware of what's there in the mind and anxieties. Sometimes memories, which can concern us. We notice that they're actually there in the background, and we become a little bit more aware of them. And how a person responds to those is very important, that we learn to sit with them and not struggle with them. We notice that they're just images, in a sense, coming and going in the mind. So a person needs to be very gentle in the way they cultivate that sort of attached awareness with them before they soon start to lose their amount of emotive influence on us. So that's one thing to take a little bit of care with as well. And it's important not to see the meditation process and the mindfulness process disconnected with a responsible approach to problem solving. We're not talking about going and sitting on a mountaintop somewhere and cutting off from life and everything else. We're, in a sense, going within, refreshing, renewing, clarifying, but from that, re-engaging with the world, but learning to re-engage with it in a different way. So sometimes people can misunderstand that it's about it being a process of cutting off or being removed from the world, and it's actually one of learning to engage with the world, but in a different sort of way. There's some of the kinds of things that people can sort of sometimes notice. Each one can be worked through. It's good if a person can learn from an experienced teacher, if that's what's sort of necessary. But there's some of the things that sometimes people go through in the initial stages.
Now, I'm wondering, Craig, if meditation is, if you like, an increased state of awareness, whether or not it's helpful for people who are having sleep troubles. I know a lot of my patients really struggle with sleep, particularly when they're under stress.
It's becoming an increasing problem, and all the effects that follow on from poor quality sleep. And it seems funny to say, how does a practice in the general run of things that helps us to increase our level of awareness also help us to sleep? It's the restful awareness which is important. And also a person can practice this sort of exercise at night, so maybe before breakfast, before dinner, but also can practice when they go to bed at night. So just lying down, practicing lying down and being aware of the head of the pillow, letting the body relax, just simply resting the attention with the breathing, for example, allowing the thoughts in the mind to come and to go. The thoughts that often keep us sort of activated. I've got a lot to do tomorrow. Oh, I should have done all these things today, and will this turn out? Will that turn out? And just noticing these thoughts, noticing the stream of thought, but learning not to engage in it, not to struggle with it, but not to engage in it. And what can often happen is that the natural process, the natural sort of downtime, if you like, in terms of letting us let go and go into sleep. We're not trying to make ourselves go to sleep, but it can help it to teach us to let go and allow the natural sleep to just sort of come. So the more we try and get to sleep, the more we try and make it happen, the more result-driven we get with sleep, again, the more counterproductive it is. So it can very much help with that. But over a number of weeks, and in fact months, that as the general level of busyness of the mind reduces during the day, it starts to also happen during sleep. That is, the amount of busyness and activation of the mind during the evening, which keeps us on a very superficial level of sleep, and that tends to settle a bit. And so sleep tends to be much deeper and much better quality. But a person needs to be patient with that. But often, and in fact people who've been practicing regularly over years, in fact, find that they need a lot less sleep than they otherwise would. So yes, it's a very healthy investment in better quality sleep.
Can meditation be also used in sort of difficult, confronting situations? So if you have a particularly stressful meeting or event or something that you need to deal with, is there a way in which one can use some of these skills to help manage this challenge?
Yes, a lot of the challenge and a lot of the fear arises from the mind launching in and brooding over events before they've even happened. And getting so apprehensive. We can get so nervous and stressed about something that when it actually comes to the event, we find we're much less able to actually deal with it. And with stress and performance, it's interesting. Stress will only take us so far, but it's actually learning to relax in a focused way that helps us to function better in more difficult situations. Help us also to stay on an even keel. We may be in the midst of a situation and have angry thoughts coming to mind, or stressful thoughts or fearful thoughts coming to mind, but over time we find that we can actually in the moment notice them and learn not to get hooked on them, caught on them. It's really like letting go. We learn to actually let them come but go in the moment. Be less deflected by them, if you like, perhaps another way of putting it. And so often we find that the usual habitual response, it just doesn't over time arise like it used to. In fact, sometimes we find that just in that letting go, just in that standing back from ourselves, the usual angry response, the usual situation that would have produced stress, we see it in a totally different way. And often we find there's a sense of humour that starts to arise where there was a sense of tragedy. And so our perspective changes, but we're not so caught on the usual things that we're caught by. Habitual response starts to change, but the thing about this process is that the change is gradual and very gentle. It's through awareness. It's not through wrestling or suppressing our responses and fears and anxieties. It's learn that we don't have to be so influenced by them. So the process is a very gentle one over time.
Another question that I had for you today, Craig, is what role music might have. It seems to me that a lot of what we've been talking about is to do with sort of the pace or the rhythm of things. And I've certainly found in my clinical experience that some patients have benefited greatly really by immersing themselves, often in sort of classical, quite slow, rhythmical music that they've found helpful. Other patients I've found have sort of enjoyed some of the sort of new age sort of music or nature tapes that they've found very helpful too. What's been your experience with music in helping patients?
Music can certainly be used very consciously, helping us to deal with stress and in fact facilitating meditation. There are certain sorts of music that are very conducive to that. And you mentioned classical music, and in fact if you went way back, very ancient forms of music, not just in our own culture but from other cultures, have very much this meditative quality about them. So we have ancient Gregorian chant and so on, which is becoming extremely popular. Hildegard von Bingen, another great composer from many centuries ago, but it has this beautiful, restful, clear, meditative or contemplative quality about it. From the East, things like the shakuhachi flute and so on, again, similar kinds of qualities. So music can be used very consciously, and in using the mindfulness exercise, one can get to the stage of the physical relaxation, awareness on the breath, and then when moving into the listening phase, to then just start a piece of music. Listen for as long as one wishes to listen to, but practicing the mindfulness to the music. And that can be very beneficial as well. So it can facilitate it. And one should be conscious also without criticizing any forms of music, but nevertheless conscious of the fact that there are other forms of music that can, if we notice, can actually increase levels of stress, increase levels of agitation, anger, frustration, again. So there are certain sorts of music that can feed other emotions. And so one wants to be quite conscious of what sort of music we're feeding the mind with, and choose our diet as carefully as we would choose our diet if we were choosing healthy food for the body. And it's a little bit like that with the mind, that if we want to deal with our stress better, then we choose sorts of music that help us to do that.
It's interesting you mentioned diet, because it seems to me that some of the philosophies that you've been discussing and the incorporating meditation into one's life really is part of a sort of a way of life, if you like. And I wonder, for starters, if you could talk about where diet and the sort of foods and, if you like, drugs that we put into ourselves in terms of excessive amounts of coffee, which we're all prone to do during times of stress, how that impacts on our stress and how we should look at managing those.
Yes, it's very hard to maintain, firstly, a balanced lifestyle, a healthy, balanced lifestyle when stress is a problem, because it keeps on, we keep on reverting to unhelpful patterns of behaviour. So often lifestyle changes in a very natural, gentle way when we learn to do things like meditate. We become more conscious of habit, but more able to very gently choose and correct that. But the other things too, that the drugs to help us to relax, or the drugs to help us to sort of stimulate and get going, and there's lots of, from things you can get over the counter to things that you don't get over the counter to try and remedy the situation. And it's a very unhelpful way of using our energy. We either don't conserve and use our energy wisely, and we find we've got to keep on replenishing with stimulants and so on, or we find that we've become so overactive that we find it difficult to relax in natural ways, and so we use other ways to try and sedate and level that, bring those levels of energy back down to a more manageable sort of pace. So this sort of process that we've been talking about is a very natural way of doing that, and so we can conserve energy by not wasting it in stress and anxiety and so on, but we can also use our energy in a much more productive and well-guided way. See, our energy, there's only so much that we have, and we replenish a certain amount in sleep and rest and so on, but if we don't use our energy wisely and in a mindful way, then we squander it. It will be used not for productive work and activity in our day-to-day lives, but it will be used to create stress and tension physically and emotionally. So it's a very important issue, how we use our energy and the sort of balanced lifestyle we lead from that. And this can facilitate certainly with both of those.
Are there any concluding comments that you'd like to make to the listeners as we come to the end of today's discussion?
Perhaps just to reiterate that using this approach, the mindfulness meditation exercise is like the cornerstone, and then taking some of these principles discussed on the first side of the tape, perhaps week by week, and exploring them in the light of our own experience, noticing our own experience. And to take a long-term view to this, because what we find quite soon is that mindfulness is not just a strategy for helping me to manage stress a little bit better or helping me to function in difficult situations a little bit better, but we actually find it's teaching us a way of living more consciously, a way of living more connectedly with the people and events around us, and a way of learning to live more productively. And in the process, learning something very important about ourselves, learning to understand ourselves better, learning to understand ourselves more deeply. And so from many different points of view, this is relevant to us. And we might practice or start for one particular reason, but we find that the side effects are very good. So it's useful to see it as a long-term thing, and to be patient with the process and just see what we discover step by step in our experience.
Thanks very much, Craig.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Craig.